Madam President, I am providing this briefing on behalf of the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu. The Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, launched on 24 February 2022, in violation of the UN Charter and of international law, continues to inflict large-scale suffering on the people of Ukraine. As we approach the tragic milestone of 1,000 days since the start of the invasion, we continue to witness unimaginable levels of civilian deaths and injuries, with escalating Russian attacks reported across the country. It is worth repeating, attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are unacceptable. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited under international law. All parties to any conflict have an obligation to respect and protect civilians, as well as to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Madam President, transfers of arms and ammunition and the provision of other forms of military assistance to the armed forces of Ukraine have continued. Information from various governments regarding these transfers is accessible through open sources. The transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that those weapons have been used and are likely to be used in Ukraine. Recent reports also refer to the presence of third-party military personnel in the Russian Federation to assist in military operations against Ukrainian forces. We urge all concerned to refrain from any steps that may lead to further spillover and intensification of the war. I reiterate that any transfer of weapons and ammunition must take place consistently with the applicable international legal framework, including, of course, relevant Security Council resolutions, which in certain instances impose sanctions and restrictive measures on such transfers. Reported use and transfer of cluster munitions are deeply concerning in the light of the indiscriminate effect that these weapons have, combined with the widespread contamination they cause. The universal participation in and the full implementation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons must remain a priority. Humanitarian imperatives have long driven disarmament efforts. I call on all states to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations and to become parties as a matter of priority to disarmament treaties and comply with the obligations therein. Compliance with these obligations is crucial in preventing unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury to persons and in protecting civilians. It is in times of heightened tensions and insecurities that we should reaffirm our commitment to humanitarian disarmament and preserve global efforts to protect civilians. Madam President, the transfer of weapons and ammunition into any armed conflict carries the risk of diversion and, by extension, raises serious doubts, serious escalation concerns. Measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion of weapons and ammunition are key for preventing further instability and insecurity in Ukraine, the region, and beyond. Such efforts by all parties involved in arms transfers will also be essential to post-conflict recovery. Importing, producing, exporting, and transit states must act responsibly at every step along the arms and ammunition transfer chain to prevent and detect diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse. Pre-transfer risk assessments, marking, and record-keeping practices, as well as tracing and investigation capabilities are of utmost importance. Effective physical security and stockpile management of arms and ammunition, as well as customs and border control measures, are also key. To prevent the diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade, states have also established a number of arms control treaties and instruments. This includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, and its International Tracing Instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. Universal participation in the relevant treaties, as well as full and effective implementation of these treaties and instruments, must remain a priority. Madam President, between 24 February 2022 and 30 September 2024, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded over 11,973 civilians killed and more than 25,943 civilians injured in Ukraine. According to the OHCHR, September was the month with the highest number of civilians casualties in 2024, continuing a trend of higher civilian casualties that started in July. The use of uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles by the Russian Federation continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. In addition, there have also been reports of a number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian objects. Just like any other weapon or weapon systems, armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas remains one of the most significant threats to civilians in armed conflict. Such use of these weapons is unacceptable in view of the pattern of civilian harm and the likelihood of indiscriminate effects. I reiterate the Secretary General's call for states to reduce the human cost of weapons by endorsing the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, if they have not already done so. Madam President, I wish to reiterate the United Nations' support for all meaningful efforts to bring a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with international law, including the UN Charter and relevant General Assembly resolutions. I thank you for your attention.